Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Chai Talk with Wajatli for the Left Hook Substack, where I invite a subject matter expert who is far smarter than me to break down one big or more than one big question or questions in 30 minutes or less. And today I am very excited because I've been wanting to talk to him for a long time, ever since I read his book. We have historian Timothy Ryback. In addition to being a historian, he is also the author of the excellent Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power. He's also the director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation in The Hague. He's joining me all the way from Europe, and he's also been writing several very informative columns for The Atlantic. He just had this great essay that came out this week. Oh, I don't know why. We'll find out why he decided to write an essay about Hitler's use of a bogus crisis of public order to make himself dictator. Using disorder he helped manufacture, the chancellor seized control of Bavaria. Very, very, very topical for some strange reason. So, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to ask you, and you know, your framing is fantastic in the article, and I recommend everyone use it. You know, straight history. That's what Tim did. He just connected all the dots. How did Hitler manufacture a crisis to become a dictator? And then my job, because you're just the historian, is to see the parallels to what's happening right now in my home state of California, where in the past week, there are now, Tim, 4,000 National Guard members, 700 Marines, and the LAPD. And we've just found out that they're being used against U.S. citizens and residents, where the National Guard is helping ICE round up people without warrants, without due process. There are people who've been arrested who are pregnant women, citizens, 9-month-old kids. ICE is showing up at preschools, elementary schools. They arrested a union leader. And Donald Trump is using words like invasion, rebellion, insurrection. In addition, I'm sure you saw that shameful speech in Fort Bragg where he's politicizing the military. And this weekend, there's tanks, Timothy. I'm right here in Washington, D.C., Virginia. There's tanks rolling down the streets, and $45 million will be spent for a military parade for our great leader. To me, it's very reminiscent of people like Hitler and Mussolini. But I yield the floor to you. Why, oh, why would you write this piece at this time?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Maj. I actually wrote this piece some time ago, and my working title, the framing of it is credited to the great editors of The Atlantic. They're the ones who put contact, because my concept around it was on the very exciting topic of Adolf Hitler's opinions and views on federalist systems. So I was writing about, Hitler and federalism, just like a couple of months ago, I wrote about Adolf Hitler's agricultural tariffs. And
Mm.
I kind of wonder, I promise you, 6 months ago, had I gone to any publication in America and said, wow, would you be interested in an article on Adolf Hitler and federalism or Hitler's agricultural tariffs? I think you know well enough what kind of answer you'd get. Uh, it's
I think they'd be chomping at the bit, giving you the premium dollar, Tim, for that.
I find it astonishing that these issues are relevant. Before diving into the specifics, actually, let me dive into one specific before we get into the general things. But it is interesting, this use of military, which I personally find somewhat. I live in Europe, so it's not as immediate for me, but it is astonishing to me that that the military is being used within one of the 50 federated states of America. I don't think Canada's joined yet.
Not yet. Not
So
yet.
we only have 50 at this point. But Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor at 11:30 in the morning on Monday, January 30th, 1933. He holds his first cabinet meeting at um, at 5 o'clock that afternoon. And he sits there with his Minister of Defense, Minister of Economic Affairs, Minister of the Interior, on and on. and he's wants to undertakes takes on some introduce some very draconian policies that he knows would cause social unrest.
Mm,
In some ways intentionally so. And he raises the issue of if things get too out of hand, can he, he would like to send in the military to quell public unrest. The Minister of Defense sitting there at the table, a career military officer, Werner von Blomberg, tells him, with all due respect, Mr. Chancellor, the German military is trained exclusively to fight an external enemy.
mm,
It is unthinkable that a German soldier could be ordered to shoot a German citizen on German soil. And he put Adolf Hitler in his place, and Hitler had to back off of that. So this was something, and it's rather astonishing to me because this is something that Hitler was not in his. Actually, I'm trying to think in his entire time. He used the police, he used his stormtroopers, he used the SS, he used the Gestapo to suppress people. I don't think another historian may correct me, but I don't think there's any case where Adolf Hitler used the military against his own citizens.
wow, that's even more shocking because we were mentioning this right before I pressed record. Donald Trump has quoted Hitler several times in the past year, even. General Kelly has admitted when General Kelly, four-star general in the first administration, was his first, who was Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, the position then now occupied by Kristi Noem, who doesn't know the definition of habeas corpus and wears a $60,000 Rolex watch while posing in front of prisons. And a lot of historians said the way she was posing in front of these brown men in the El Salvador prison reminded them much of World War II. But I digress. General Kelly, who became chief of staff to Donald Trump, said that Donald Trump used to praise Hitler's generals and used to whine and complain that he didn't have loyal generals like Hitler did. But he also quoted Hitler talking about immigrants poisoning the blood. And in October, right before he was elected, Tim, Donald Trump said he would be open to unleashing the military and National Guard against the enemy from within. That was Hitler's language. And, I just assumed, you're the historian, but I assumed Hitler did that, but you're telling me Hitler didn't, which is even more chilling. Because I know Hitler was terrible, used his SS and his Gestapo, but we right now have the ICE agents being deployed to terrorize. And to me, I'm using this language. I have said that the ICE agents, the way they're being used by Trump and Stephen Miller right now, is very similar to the SS, the brown shirts, and Gestapo. They're literally masked agents picking up folks, Tim, in America without due process, kidnapping them and terrorizing them with impunity.
Yeah. Well, let me just say one thing, Raj. I'm a historian. I'm not a political pundit. I'm not a commentator on American politics, and I do not draw parallels. But I'll tell you one thing. I mean, you quoted Hitler, and you quoted Trump, and I do remember him saying that he wanted generals like Hitler had. Mr. Trump does not want generals like Adolf Hitler had. On July 20th, 1944, Hitler's generals tried to blow him up with with a briefcase full of explosives. So he had a very antagonistic relationship to his military, almost to the very end. So it was, that was a
No, but
very,
that's so fascinating to me because me drawing the parallels, that's not the case right now in the United States of America, Tim. Because in the first administration of Trump, what you said reminded me of what a lot of the advisors initially said. Mark Esper, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, Donald Trump asked Mark Esper, "Hey, can I just shoot these unarmed protesters?" And Mark Esper's like, "No, you can't have the military shoot unarmed protesters in the leg." And apparently Trump was very upset. Well, those guardrails are gone. And that Fort Bragg speech where he had a curated list of people who were hooting and hollering behind him. When I'm just curious, as a historian, with Hitler, eventually the entire society seemed to be lockstep and goose stepping. But you said the antagonistic history with the military during Hitler's time. Was it like the military all in? Was it purged? Were there people secretly always opposed? Were there any guardrails? I'm just very curious.
Yeah. It did take actually, I mean, Hitler, frankly, Trump coming into his second term as president has had much more leeway than Hitler came in as chancellor at the beginning. And we talk about, as you said, the German people marching in lockstep. What? When Hitler was appointed chancellor in the previous election, he had had 33% of the vote, which meant that two-thirds of the Germans were not backing this guy. So,
Mm,
frankly, Donald Trump had polling numbers that Adolf Hitler could only have dreamed of at that point. Now, it was a long process of bringing bringing the German people into line, but also taming the military. And there was a very antagonistic relationship there. And it was only through a very gradual purging of the military and the Foreign Office, the basically the German State Department, that this happened. The German ambassador to London, when Hitler, this is on record, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, the German ambassador to London went into Whitehall, the British Foreign Office, and said, "My new chancellor is a madman. Be careful." We
wow.
have this record from the British. So there were structures in place that were actually really, you talked about guardrails. There were a lot of guardrails constraining Hitler as he went along. Now, the man, and what's interesting is, he was anti-democratic from the very beginning. I mean, he wanted, back in 1923, he tried to stage a military putsch. I'm not a military putsch, a putsch, a violent putsch to overthrow the government. Failed. He ended up in prison. He was a convicted felon. One of the big criticisms of Hitler when he came into office was people were going, "My God, can you have a convicted felon accused of treason running the country?" But Hitler understood that he took the PowerPoints that he had and the leverage that he had, and he used it in a very nuanced and very sophisticated way. And gradually, and it's a two-step process, he first disabled certain democratic processes and then dismantled them. But in fact, when you look at Hitler's rise to power, every step of the way was done within the bounds of the Constitution.
And before you
So
said dismantled, you said disabled, and I think that's very important because I remember Hitler said this is going to be the beginning of 1,000-year Reich. I think he lasted 13 years before killing himself, but in 13 years, the damage was done. That's not that long, Tim, to see the erosion of a democratic society. And where he comes in with 33% of the popularity, and Trump has had what 38 to 42%. And already Trump has much more compliance within establishment and doesn't have that much resistance. In 13 years, we all saw what he did, and then he ended up killing himself, as most authoritarians we realize are weak men. But that the disabling. How long did it take Hitler to essentially disable and weaken the establishments that were put in place as guardrails? I'm talking about media, I'm talking about judges, and I'm talking about specifically the police state.
you said it all. I don't need to say anything else. I'll tell you what's interesting. It was a month of Mondays in early 33. Hitler is appointed on Monday, January 30th. On Monday, yeah, January 30th. On Monday, February 6th, they introduce fairly draconian press policies in which they begin banning newspapers. So one of his first targets was going after the press.
Hmm.
The following Monday, the second Monday in February, they begin purging the government offices. And they basically send this memorandum around where they say, unless you have absolute loyalty to the new administration, you should do the honorable thing and resign. They went in and they threw out anyone who was not a National Socialist. Hermann Goering, who's one of Hitler's key lieutenants, was put in charge of this, and he used interesting. We've heard these chainsaw metaphors before, the wood chipper.
Yeah.
Well, what Hermann Goering said was he talked about you cut jobs the way you cut wood. And he says, when you chop wood, chips fly. And that was a literal quote. As I say, it's not a chainsaw, but it was literally going in there and saying, we're just cutting out all this stuff. So they purged the basically the civil service. They went after the press. They purged the civil service, and the following Monday they basically bring the industrialists together.
Yep.
These are all, well, nowadays they're billionaires, but at that time they were millionaires. These were people who wanted absolutely nothing to do with Hitler for the previous 12 years. Keep in mind, the name of his movement was the National Socialist Workers' Party. Now, this is not a title that would appeal to a German industrialist or a German banker. But after he was appointed chancellor and they saw the way the winds were going, on that third Monday in February, they all showed up and started tossing money into his campaign, building up his support. And it was clear, they knew government contracts were at stake. They had obligations to their shareholders. They worried only about the bottom line. And one corporation I'll mention there is one called IG Farben, and they were the largest chemical pharmaceutical conglomerate in the world, I think, at the time. They also produced a lot of what is it called when you clear warehouses for disinfecting them?
Oh,
They had a special fumigation gas called Cyclone B. Now, this is a corporation that it was built as a Weimar democracy institution, not a single Nazi on their board. Jewish scientists, Jewish board members and executives, they go in 1933 from being a company that was committed to Weimar democracy. Within a decade, they're supplying all of the extermination gas for the facilities at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen. So that's how those things change. That's the third Monday in February. The fourth one, you've already mentioned, was the Reichstag fire. No one knew where things were going. And this is the thing. When the Germans were wondering what's going on with this. They're seeing these erosions of the guardrails. People are starting to come online, but Hitler still was not completely secure in power. There had been 3 chancellors in the previous 8 months who had been dismissed. Nothing prevented the president Hindenburg from dismissing Hitler as the fourth. But when on that Monday, 9 o'clock in the evening, when the Reichstag goes up in flames, Hitler sees his opportunity. Now, what it is, the police were there on the spot. There was a single Dutchman, a Dutch communist, who was caught with his shirt down. He'd been setting flyers. He was just kind of a crazy guy, but he was caught. They knew who it was, but Hitler, the Nazis just knew they had to seize this moment, basically declared a national emergency. The next morning, there was a special decree that suspended civil liberties, suspended press freedom, suspended habeas corpus. Just everything, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. It was all out the door. That was paragraph one, and this is going to bring us to your home state of California. Paragraph two, no one was really looking at except for the governors of the 17 federated states. The paragraph two said any state which is not any state government which is not capable of maintaining public
Order.
order, um, the government has the right to install what they called a Reichskommissar, sort of a commissioner from the Reich government, from the central government, to ensure public order. And if you are looking, and this is the governors of the states looked at this thing and said, "Oh my God, this is an attack on the federated system," and it was. And that was actually the Reichstag fire was the beginning of the end, only because Hitler took this crisis, manipulated it. I mean, it was a terrible act. I mean, it was in some ways a bit like a 9/11 moment for Americans, but I mean, for Germans, it was their 9/11 moment. But it was the Nazis just exploited this and were able, through legal means, to basically put Hitler on the final path to dictatorship.
So the disabling and then the dismantling by exploiting a tragedy and an emergency, and then implementing essentially martial law, suspending institutions and elections, and saying, the commander in chief, by the power vested in him, has to take control and secure the nation, and it is in your interest, the nation's interest, that you give up your freedoms and liberties to the supreme leader to repel the invaders and threats from within. And with that being said, the language that is being used right now in 2025 is invasion by Stephen Miller. There's no invasion. Insurrection. There's no insurrection. Rebellion. There's no rebellion. The LAPD, which is like its own mini military, which has a very fraught relationship with its black and brown communities, it's gone out and say, we got this. National Guard are out, military are out, being used against literally American people. Donald Trump has said, as of yesterday, he's open to using the Insurrection Act. And what I've said, Timothy, is Americans suffer from a failure of imagination. And in our country, you're in Europe right now. Europeans do not suffer from a failure of imagination because they remember it happened in Europe. We think, we're okay with the United States of America. I've heard so many informed people say the guardrails will hold. And we're seeing the guardrails not holding. And the Wall Street Journal, that leftist rag, the Wall Street Journal, had a piece out this week saying that Stephen Miller wanted escalation. He knew by sending ICE agents to Home Depot and 7-Eleven and terrorizing folks without any warrants or due process, it would create this crisis. And now you're seeing folks within this Trump administration using these words of crisis, justifying the use and abuse of power, things that are so abnormal are now being normalized, Tim. The fact that ICE agents are just being unleashed, that's completely abnormal. National Guard, no place to sleep because there's no accommodations but being unleashed. That's not normal. All of this has become normalized in the past week. And I want to ask you this question because, and I'm asking you as a historian, many people, not you, have compared Stephen Miller to Goebbels. But I was talking to Rick Wilson, and he said, he's less like Goebbels, more like Heydrich. Can you tell people who Heydrich was?
Well, Heydrich was I mentioned earlier, sort of the Gestapo and the SS. Heydrich was an assistant to Heinrich Himmler. He was a sort of a mid 20-year-old guy, ran a special office in the Nazi party headquarters in Munich. And it was a little office where he kept card files on everyone who was and basically an enemies list. But when the Nazis took over, Heydrich suddenly had access to all the police files. Now, the German police, the state police, had been investigating over the last 12 years all of, they'd been, had moles and spies in the Communist Party, keeping reports on them, keeping on them, but also they had them implanted in the Nazis. Heydrich comes in and is in charge now of all the intelligence services and suddenly has access to all of the state police files,
Mm,
which means he knows the people who had been spying on the Germans, on the Nazis for the last 12 years. It was an absolute nightmare for these people. You had people who had been in the service of the German state police, for whichever state was it, Prussia, be it Bavaria, be it Baden-Württemberg, who were basically filing these reports that infiltrated the Nazi system. And suddenly, Heydrich is sitting there with their names on cars. And they were, I mean, you can imagine what happened to them, tortured and murdered under the most horrific circumstances in places like Dachau or Sachsenhausen. Um, but I guess if we're looking at who is this person, I think one of the people who's underrated in all of this is a man named Hans Frank. Now,
mm,
Hans Frank was a trained lawyer. He was graduated from the top of his class in law school in Munich, was the first generation of Germans educated in the Weimar Republic, which meant this guy understood the Constitution and the legal system as well as anyone and was a brilliant lawyer on top of it. And he became Hitler's chief legal advisor. And it was actually Hans Frank who designed the entire strategy for Hitler, how to dismantle a democracy through democratic process. So I think if you're looking for, I know these names, Goebbels, Goering, all
yeah.
these, and the list goes on and on and on, and Heydrich and Himmler, but actually Hans Frank he was the legal mind behind this and really one of the key people in this. Where he ended up being the governor general of Nazi occupied Poland, and he ended up hanged at the neck in Nuremberg for his complicity in all the horrors perpetrated.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because again, going back full circle, and I got 2 minutes left. I could speak to you for 2 hours because I'm a nerd like that. Uh, Hitler said he'd rule for 1,000 years. It lasted 13. These industrialists who said, why let a genocide get in the way of good profit? Some of those people were tried and convicted for war crimes. Many of these people were hanged and killed. Unfortunately, before they went out, they killed so many folks. But it wasn't just one man. And I think that's so important. It was the complicity of so many of these individuals. You were saying.
And most importantly, the elected representatives of the people. When you talk about guardrails, Hitler, in order to become the dictator that he became, everything was legal. He needed something called an enabling act, which was to give him dictatorial power. He required two-thirds majority vote in the Reichstag, basically a 600 body legislative body. He needed their approval. Now, they banned the communists, they suppressed the social democrats, but he still needed two-thirds of the vote of the existing body. And what you found was these centrist parties, these elected representative people standing up there when the law was put before them and said, Chancellor Hitler, we're concerned about your attack on civil liberties. We're concerned about your attacks on Germans in general, even Jewish Germans, meaning we're concerned about your anti-democratic positions. We're concerned that you will become a dictator. But with all those concerns, despite them, we're giving you our vote. And you hear Congress, you hear the legislative laughing as they go through this exercise. And this was, one person observer called it the mass suicide of political parties. But this is where you can see on that day, on that afternoon with the voting, it was a democratic society committing suicide. knowing full well what they were doing, do this. And I would say, when you talk about guardrails, our final guardrail are our elected representatives.
Mm,
And frankly, for me, I'm an endlessly optimistic person. Let's wait and see what the midterms bring us,
yeah.
see what the American people think of what they've seen for the first 2 years, and then see what our elected representatives ultimately are there to do.
Let's not engage in a murder suicide. Sadly, we have a template of what's happened before when our elected officials, those on the front lines, those with the guard lines, guardrails, obey in advance. And Timothy Snyder and others have warned us about obeying in advance. What we thought was unconscionable and could never happen is happening and has happened before. So let's hope we learn from history. Tim, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic. Tim is a historian, the author of this great book, Takeover, Hitler's Final Rise to Power, director of the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation at The Hague. He's been writing fantastic articles for The Atlantic. His latest is Hitler used a bogus crisis of public order to make himself dictator. I'm going to put it in the write-up. And Tim, I got 10 seconds. Final word to you. Shamelessly promote yourself. What did I miss?
Nothing. I would say that what I would say is for the sake of America, come November 2026, get out there and vote the right way.
Thank you,
I'm
Tim,
doing
and
that not for me.
amen.
I'm doing that for my country.
For the country. Thanks, Tim.
Okay.
Folks, this has been The Left Hook. Until next time, be kind to yourself and please don't be a fascist. Thanks, Tim. That's great.